Before there were empires, before marble roads and legionary camps, there was silence broken only by the rustling of forests so vast they seemed endless. In those woods, mist clung to the trees, and rivers whispered secrets in forgotten tongues. This was Galan, ancient land before Rome, before written memory, alive with tribes that spoke to spirits rather than kings. Imagine it now, the crackling of firelight reflecting on bronze shields, the hum of chants echoing through valleys, the smell of pine smoke and wet earth. This was not a single people, but 1,000 voices bound by blood, ritual, and war. From the windswept plains of the north to the deep forests of the south, the Gauls lived in scattered tribes, proud, fierce, and independent. Some were farmers, their fields dotted with wooden huts and circular enclosures. Others roamed as warriors and traders, following the pull of rivers like the Seine and the Rhine. They knew no borders, no kings, only loyalty to clan and honor. To outsiders, they seemed wild, unpredictable, dangerous. Yet to themselves, they were free and tamed children of the earth. The Romans would later call them Parpari, barbarians. But that word carried more fear than contempt, because when Rome looked north, it saw not savages, but a reflection of its own pastoral, unrefined and powerful. The Gauls worshipped forces older than God's spirits of water, stone, and sky. Their druids, cloaked in white, spoke in riddles and ruled not with swords but with words. Some say the druids could still the winds, others that they could see into the hearts of men. No Roman could ever truly understand them, and perhaps that's why Rome feared them most. Before the chronicles of Caesar, before the echoes of conquest, Gaul was a mystery, living, breathing world at the edge of civilization. Its people carved stories into memory, not stone. They lived for courage, for song, for the thrill of battle. And as twilight fell across the forests, they believed their ancestors watched through the flicker of the flames. Tonight, as we wander into their story, listen closely to the trees, to the rivers, to the silence between heartbeats, because that is where the Gauls still live, waiting for their tale to be told. And as dawn begins to break on the first chapter of their history, one question lingers. How could a people so free, so fierce, be remembered only through the words of their conquerors? Long before Caesar set his eyes upon the misty lands beyond the Alps, Gaul was already ancient. Its people, descended from the proto-Celtic tribes that once roamed across Europe, had built a world entirely their own. To the west, the Armoricans fished the cold Atlantic waters. To the south, the Arverni ruled mountain strongholds. To the east, the Aedui, Remi, and Sequani vied for power along the great rivers. There was no single kingdom only, a web of alliances, rivalries, and shifting loyalties that rose and fell like the tides. Each tribe had its own chieftains, its own gods, its own heroes sung around smoky hearths. Yet beneath that division was a shared heartbeat of culture woven through art, war, and the sacred. Their warriors wore torques of gold and silver around their necks, symbols of power and divine favor. Their craftsmen shaped weapons so finely balanced they seemed to hum when drawn from their sheaths. In the markets of Bibracte and Gergovia, traders from far lands came to barter for amber, salt, and iron. The Gauls were not the savages Rome imagined. They were inventors, artisans, and diplomats. Their language flowed like water, lyrical and sharp, binding tribe to tribe through song and story. And yet, even in their brilliance, they carried within them the seeds of their undoing. Pride, independence, the unwillingness to kneel to any power but their own. When one tribe grew too strong, others turned against it. When outsiders threatened, unity came too late. Their world thrived on tension, chaos, and beauty intertwined. But for now, in these centuries before Rome's gaze turned northward, Gaul thrived in its own rhythm. Great feasts marked the passing of seasons. Warriors painted their bodies in blue before battle. Druids gathered in sacred groves beneath oaks said to hold the breath of the gods. They measured time not by kings or conquests, but by moons, harvests, and blood spilled in honor of the old ways. To live was to fight, to die was to be remembered. Somewhere in the vast forests, a young chieftain sharpened his blade beneath a blood-red sunset, unaware that centuries later his people's name would fade into myth. And as the wind moved through the tall grass, carrying the scent of wood smoke and rain, it whispered a warning only the Druids could hear. Something was coming from the south, something powerful enough to silence even the songs of the Gauls. In the deep heart of Gaul, far from the clash of tribes and the noise of battle, there were places few dared to tread, sacred groves where the air itself seemed to breathe. Here, under towering oaks older than memory, the Druids gathered. They were the unseen architects of Gaulish life, priests, judges, poets, and philosophers bound by secrets passed from mouth to ear for generations. To the people, they were the voice of the gods, interpreters of the divine, and keepers of the mysteries that no sword could conquer. The Druids taught that all things were connected: men, trees, rivers, stars, and that death was not an end but a doorway. To kill was not murder, but transformation. To die was to begin again. Their ceremonies were shrouded in ritual and silence, and when the moon rose full above the groves, some said the earth itself trembled. In these circles of shadow and flame, the Druids read omens in the flight of birds, the crack of firewood, the pattern of entrails. To them, fate was not written in stone, but in the living world that surrounded them. It is said they forbade their teachings to be written down, fearing that words trapped on parchment would lose their spirit. And so their knowledge lived only in memory, flowing through generations like a river, unseen yet eternal. Their influence reached every corner of Gaul. No king could be crowned without their blessing. No battle could be fought without their sanction. Even the fiercest chieftains bowed their heads when a Druid spoke. They governed through wisdom, not wealth, and their authority came from the belief that they alone could touch the realm beyond the living. The Romans would later see them as sorcerous, dangerous relics of a wild faith that threatened order. But to the Gauls, they were the guardians of balance. When storms came or crops failed, it was the Druids who lit the fires and called to the gods for mercy. When a warrior fell, they whispered prayers to guide his soul through the mist. The light of their fires glowed like stars scattered across the land, symbols of a faith rooted deeper than empire, deeper than time. Yet beneath that quiet power, the winds were shifting. Across the mountains, a new kind of fire was stirring: discipline. Conquest, and soon the sacred groves would tremble beneath a different kind of god. The peace that once lingered in Gaul's forests began to thin like mist before dawn. Beyond the southern mountains, the world was changing. Rome, once a distant rumor, had become a relentless machina, hunger made flesh. Its legions moved like storms across the land, disciplined, silent, and unstoppable. Each conquest fed the next. And now its gaze turned north, toward the land of the Gauls. Traders from Massilia whispered of strange men in shining armor, who built roads of stone that cut through valleys like scars. They spoke of their standards, golden eagles that gleamed in the sunlight, and of their leaders, who believed the gods themselves walked beside them. At first, the Gauls did not fear them. They had fought invaders before Greeks, Germans, even each other. But this was different. Rome did not raid and retreat. It built, consumed, and remained. The tribes of southern Gaul began to feel its shadow first. Alliances shifted, betrayals grew common, and old rivalries reignited. The Aedui sought friendship with Rome, hoping to strengthen their position, while the Arverni and Sequani resisted, trusting in their gods and their swords. In the dim glow of the hearth, chieftains debated what this new power meant. Some saw opportunity, iron, wine, and trade. Others saw death disguised as progress. The Druids warned that the balance of the land was in peril, that the gods were restless, that too much blood had been spilled without honor. Yet pride and ambition drowned out prophecy. Across the fields and rivers, the people carried on farmers sowing grain, blacksmiths hammering iron, warriors boasting of battles yet to come. But in the distance, smoke began to rise from the borderlands, and strange banners fluttered in the wind. The first Roman roads crept into the heart of Gaul, straight and unyielding, as if cutting through the soul of the land itself. The forests that had stood for millennia began to fall to the sound of axes. The old gods watched, silent. Still, the tribes danced, feasted, and fought, believing that the forests would always protect them, that Gaul would remain untouched. But every empire begins with a whisper, and every fall begins with pride. Soon, the legions would cross the rivers. The eagle standards would rise against the sky, and the songs of the Druids would meet the silence of steel. The first meeting between Rome and the Gauls was not of conquest, but of trade. Along the Mediterranean coast, the Romans built friendships with merchants and city-states, offering wine for furs, silver for salt, and civilization for chaos. To the Gauls, these strangers seemed disciplined yet distant men who built with stone instead of wood, who fought in lines rather than fury. But Rome's friendship was a prelude, not a promise. Slowly, her influence began to spread, not through battle, but through debt, diplomacy, and dependence. Some Gallic tribes grew rich on Roman goods, wearing imported fabrics, drinking foreign wine, even adopting fragments of Latin speech. Others grew uneasy, sensing that the price of Rome's friendship was freedom itself. When the Helvetii, a great migrating tribe from the east, began moving westward across Gaul, the delicate balance shattered. They sought new lands, but their journey threatened every tribe in their path. The Aedui allies of Rome begged for help, and from the south, help came not in the form of merchants or emissaries, but an army led by a man whose name would echo through history, Gaius Julius Caesar. To the Romans, his campaign was a duty. To the Gauls, it was the beginning of the end. Caesar came with legions unlike anything the tribes had ever seen, thousands of soldiers moving as one, each man a cog in a living engine of war. His roads followed him, his camps rose and vanished overnight, his scribes recorded every act. To some tribes, he offered protection, to others, he brought fire. In a matter of months, the Helvetii were crushed, their people scattered. Caesar wrote that it was for order, for peace, for Rome's safety. But those who survived remembered something else. The fields burned, the screams of children, the silence afterward. And as the legions marched north, rumor spread faster than their drums. Some tribes submitted, offering hostages and oaths. Others sharpened their blades and called upon their gods. For the first time, Gaul began to see itself not as a collection of tribes, but as a single land under threat. The Druids whispered of prophecy, of storms that would drown empires, of a chosen one who would unite the clans. In the shadows of their groves, the fires burned brighter, and the old gods listened. The storm had come, and its name was Rome, from the highlands of the Arverni, in the heart of central Gaul. Rose a young noble whose name would become legend, Vercingetorix, son of Celtic, heir to a lineage that had once ruled but had been broken by Roman intrigue and tribal betrayal. He watched as tribe after tribe bent their knees to Caesar, watched their warriors disarmed, their chieftains bribed, their gods forgotten beneath the weight of foreign law. Yet he also saw something that Caesar could not, the slow-burning anger, the humiliation festering like an open wound across all of Gaul when his father was executed by his own people for dreaming of unity. Vercingetorix learned what kind of courage would be needed to bind Gaul together again. He began, in secret, whispering to warriors in hidden groves, calling upon druids to bless his cause, sending emissaries to tribes who still remembered what it meant to be free. He spoke not as a conqueror but as a brother, promising not gold or power, but vengeance and pride. His words spread like fire through dry grass. The Carnates were the first to rise, slaughtering a Roman garrison in Sun. It was the spark that set all Gaul ablaze. Caesar, wintering far to the north, was caught off guard. He called it rebellion. The Gauls called it war. Vercingetorix gathered the tribes into a confederation unlike any before. Warriors poured from every forest, hill, and valley, united under the black banners of the Arverni. His strategy was not to face Rome head-on, but to starve them scorched earth. No food, no shelter, no supplies. Let the legions march hungry and cold through a land turned to ash. For a time, it worked. Caesar found himself fighting ghosts, chasing an enemy who vanished into the fog. Villages burned by Gallic hands rather than Roman torches. Crops destroyed to deny the invader. It was war as the Druids had once promised, sacred, desperate, merciless. But Caesar was no ordinary general. He adapted, turned tribe against tribe, built fortresses where none should stand, and used Roman engineering to break nature itself. Still, the dream of unity held. In every village, Vercingetorix's name was spoken like a prayer. For the first time, Gaul moved as one heartbeat, one will, one fury. And in that fleeting unity, a nation was born not yet in peace, but in defiance. The final stand of the Gauls came not with a clash of swords in open field, but behind the walls of a hilltop fortress called Elite. It was there, in 52 BCE, that Vercingetorix made his stand against Julius Caesar, knowing full well that this battle would decide the fate of his people for centuries to come. The fortress itself sat high above the plains, surrounded by forests and rivers, a natural stronghold, chosen with care and desperation. Inside its walls were tens of thousands of Gallic warriors, their faces painted, their weapons worn, their spirits flickering between courage and hunger. Outside, Caesar's legions arrived like a tide of iron, their red banners snapping in the cold wind. He did not attack. Instead, he built massive rings of fortifications encircling Alesia, wall upon wall, ditch upon ditch, stretching for miles. The Romans were not besieging a city. They were imprisoning an army. Vercingetorix watched from the ramparts as wood and stone transformed the landscape into a cage. He knew that the walls were not just meant to keep his warriors in, but to keep their allies out. For beyond the horizon, a second Gallic army was gathering, hundreds of thousands strong, marching to lift the siege. The days dragged into weeks. Food dwindled. Horses were eaten. The cries of children echoed through the camps. Still, the Gauls held on, driven by a belief that their brothers would come. When at last they did, it was like thunderous ocean of warriors descending upon the Roman lines. The battle that followed was chaos turned divine, screams, smoke, arrows blotting out the sun, men crushed under chariots and Roman shields. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix led a final charge, his warriors pouring from the gates in a desperate attempt to break through. For a moment, it seemed the Romans would be overwhelmed. But Caesar, calm as a serpent, moved his legions with mechanical precision, reinforcing one line, counterattacking another, never breaking formation. By nightfall, the Gallic relief army was shattered, fleeing into the dark. Inside the fortress, silence fell. Vercingetorix stood among the dead, his armor dull with blood and dust. He understood what must be done. The next morning, he rode alone to Caesar's camp, unarmed, and laid his sword at the Romans' feet. The dream of a united Gaul died there, but in its death, a legend was born. Whispered for generations, the warrior who defied Rome, In the decades after Alesia, the landscape of Gaul began to change, not by sudden conquest, but by the slow, methodical rhythm of Roman civilization pressing down like a hand on wet clay. Fortresses became towns, and towns became cities, their straight roads cutting through ancient forests and across sacred hills. Markets filled with Latin words and Roman coins. Amphitheaters rose where sacred groves once stood, and temples to Jupiter and Mars replaced shrines to Tyrannus and Cernunnos. The people learned to live under a new sky of laws and taxes, but deep down they still felt the pulse of the old gods. The Romans called it Gallia Comata, long-haired Gaul, both a description and a sneer, a land untamed at its roots. The process of Romanization was relentless, but not without allure. Some Gallic nobles saw opportunity in submission. They wore togas, spoke Latin, and sent their sons to study in Rome. They became senators, merchants, generals. They told themselves they were now part of something greater, something eternal. Yet the common folk knew otherwise. Beneath the veneer of Roman order, resentment festered. The heavy tribute, the forced labor, the foreign soldiers, each was a reminder that freedom had been bought and sold. Still, Rome was cunning. It offered roads, baths, and theaters. It built aqueducts and brought peace to lands once torn by tribal feuds. Many Gauls came to see the empire not as an occupier, but as a giver of stability. This was Rome's genius, not to conquer by the sword alone, but by seduction. Latin spread through trade and law, but in the countryside, the old Celtic tongue persisted, reshaped by new words, new rules, yet stubborn in spirit. Even there, gods adapted, merging with Roman deities. Epona, the horse goddess, was worshipped across the empire. Mercury took the face of Lugus by the 1st century CE. Gaul was no longer a battlefield, but a provinciate people, now Roman citizens in name, if not in soul. Yet every statue, every Latin inscription, every marble forum stood atop something buried, something that remembered. The Gauls had learned to bow without breaking. They had survived the legions, and now, in a strange irony, they began to thrive within the very empire that had once destroyed them. But beneath that calm surface, a question remained. Could a people truly become Roman if their hearts still beat to the rhythm of the forest drums? As the years turned into centuries, Rome's grip on Gaul tightened, but not without consequence. The roads that had brought Roman order also carried Roman corruption. The governors grew rich, the soldiers weary, and the peasants burdened. The forests of Gaul, once alive with the songs of druids, now echoed with the sound of axes and carts. The rivers that had once been sacred now fed aqueducts and mills. And yet, within the silence of these changes, the old identity stirred restlessly, like a ghost pacing behind locked doors. The Gauls had become Roman citizens, but they were never Roman at heart. In their festivals, the laughter had a different rhythm. Their prayers still rose toward hills that had seen older gods. Rome could pave over the land, but it could not erase its memory. Still, for a time, Gaul flourished. Trade bloomed along the Rhine and Rhine. Fine pottery, wine, and glass flowed through new markets. Towns like Lugdunum Lion became centers of wealth and learning, home to philosophers and merchants who spoke Latin with a Gallic cadence. The empire saw Gaul not as conquered, but as indispensably its granaries feeding legions, its mines fueling ambition. But prosperity carried a price. The Roman legions that once protected Gaul were drawn away to distant wars. Germanic tribes pressed against the borders, testing the cracks in the empire's armor. The once mighty frontier along the Rhine began to tremble. Villages that had not seen war in generations started building walls again. In the cities, whispers spread that the empire was weakening, that the gods of Rome had turned their faces away. The Gauls, who had lived through fire once before, recognized the scent of decay. And as the empire's heart began to falter, they prepared in silence. In hidden valleys, they spoke of freedom again, though few remembered what it truly meant. The Romans called them restless, superstitious, ungrateful. But the Gauls knew better. They had seen empires rise and fall before. What was coming was not rebellion, but return. For centuries, they had played the role Rome demanded. Farmers, soldiers, but deep within, they still carried the pulse of the forest. The old blood that waited for the empire's shadow to break, so that Gaul could once again remember itself. By the 3rd century, the world the Caesar had built began to splinter, and the first cracks in Rome's eternal facade spread across Gaul like fractures in ancient stone. The Rhine frontier, once the iron boundary between empire and chaos, now quivered beneath the weight of invasion. From the misty north came the Alemanni, the Franks, and the Vandal tribes that looked upon Gaul not as an enemy to be conquered, but as a prize to be claimed. Roman legions that had once marched with precision now fought with desperation, stretched thin across too many borders. The grand cities of Gaul Lutetia, Augusta, Treverorum, Lugdunum, saw their marble facades darken under soot and fear. Roads once filled with merchants were now lined with refugees. Farmers fleeing burned villages, temples desecrated, and children sold into slavery. The empire sent more soldiers, more governors, more promises, but the truth could not be hidden. Rome was dying, and Gaul could feel its heartbeat slowing. Amid this decay, some Gallic leaders began to wonder if loyalty to Rome still meant survival. The taxes grew unbearable, the imperial decrees absurd, and the once golden image of Rome now flickered like a torch in the wind. Then, in the year 260 CE, when the empire tore itself apart in civil war, a new vision arose from the ashes, one born not in Rome, but in Gaul itself. Postumus, a Roman general stationed in the region, declared independence and formed what would be known as the Gallic Empire. To many, it was treason. To the people of Gaul, it was deliverance. Under Postumus, the Gallic Empire minted its own coins, raised its own armies, and even claimed its own empire. For nearly 15 years, it stood as a reflection of the old unity Vercingetorix had once dreamed of, not a tribal confederation, but a Romanized Gaul standing on its own feet. Yet the echo of independence was fragile. After Postumus's death, the empire fractured again, torn by the same ambitions that had undone Rome itself. The dream slipped back into chaos, leaving behind only ruins and the faint memory of what might have been. And still, through all of it, the people of Gaul endured, not Roman, not barbarian, but something in between, waiting for the next storm to decide their fate. The brief flame of the Gallic Empire burned bright, but it burned too fast. After the death of Postumus, the unity that had held Gaul together unraveled like an old tapestry, each thread pulled by ambition, betrayal, and fear. The Roman world was collapsing in on itself, emperors rising and falling like waves, soldiers turning against their own commanders, barbarian war bands sweeping through the borders as if the gods themselves had abandoned the legions. In Gaul, the illusion of independence faded as quickly as it had formed. Successors like Victorinus and Tetricus tried to hold the dream together, but they ruled not from strength, but from desperation. Their armies were loyal only to the promise of gold. Their generals watched the frontiers crumble, while Roman envoys whispered promises of forgiveness if they surrendered. The once proud Gallic cities became islands of civilization in a sea of ruin. Trade routes closed, crops failed, and plague crept through the villages. By the year 274, the last emperor of the Gallic state, Tetricus, stood at the head of an army that no longer believed in victory. When he marched against the forces of Emperor Aurelian, the man determined to reunite the fractured empire, he carried more than weapons. He carried the burden of a people caught between two dying worlds. The battle came near Chalons, and though the banners of Gaul fluttered in the wind, their cause was already lost. Whether by treachery or exhaustion, Tetricus surrendered to Aurelian, ending the dream of a free Gaul. Rome, triumphant for a moment, celebrated the restoration of unity, but the victory was hollow. The land Aurelian reclaimed was no longer truly Romanate, was a ghost of empire, inhabited by people who had learned to live without their masters. In the years that followed, Gaul slipped further into the shadows. The legions withdrew, the cities shrank, and the old tribal divisions began to reappear beneath the Roman surface. Pagan altars were revived in secret, and local warlords began carving their own territories from the remains of imperial law. The Gallic Empire was gone, but it had left behind something powerful, memory of self-rule, a whisper that Rome was not eternal after all. And in that whisper, the seeds of a new world began to stir, one that would soon rise from the ashes of the old. When the Gallic Empire crumbled, its fall left a silence that neither Rome nor rebellion could fill. Into that silence came a new force, born beyond the misty line of the Franks. They were not a single tribe, but a confederation of warriors and clans, hardened by cold winds and endless war, drawn by the wealth and wounded beauty of Gaul. To the Romans, they were barbarians. To themselves, they were heirs to the land's destiny. The empire, stretched thin and weary, could no longer guard its borders. The once mighty Rhine frontier, where Caesar had once built his bridges of conquest, now stood open like a wound. The Franks crossed it not as invaders but as settlers, raiders who became farmers, mercenaries who became rulers. They burned towns, yes, but they also rebuilt them in their own image. Their leaders struck uneasy bargains with Roman generals, offering swords in exchange for land, titles, and legitimacy. Slowly, the distinction between Roman and Frank began to blur. Some wore Roman armor, spoke Latin, even minted coins with imperial faces. Yet their loyalty was not to Rome but to their own blood. They brought with them new laws, new customs, and an older sense of freedom that the empire had long forgotten. In the countryside, the Gallic people, tired of taxes, famine, and broken promises, found in the Franks something both alien and familiar. These warriors worshipped different gods, but they understood honor and kinship. They ruled with brutality, but also with a strange kind of honesty. As the 5th century dawned, Gaul was no longer Roman in spirit or law. The legions had vanished, the governors fled, and the marble temples crumbled into ruin. What remained was a land divided between fading Roman nobles, surviving Gallic peasants, and rising Frankish chiefs. Among those chiefs emerged one who would change everything, a young warlord named Clovis, ambitious, cunning, and destined to unite the fragments of Gaul under a new name. In him, the legacy of the Gauls, the shadow of Rome, and the ferocity of the Franks would collide. The empire that had once conquered the world was dying, but from its decay, something new was being born. The world was shifting, the old gods were fading, and the story of Gaul was about to transform into the story of France. Clovis entered history, like a storm breaking over a dying empire. Born among the Salian Franks, raised in a world where Roman marble stood beside pagan shrines, he was neither wholly barbarian nor Roman, but something sharper, bridge between ages. He came to power around the year 481, when Gaul was fractured into countless pieces, remnants of Rome clinging to fading cities, Visigoths ruling the south, Burgundians holding the east, and pagan Franks pressing from the north. Where others saw chaos, Clovis saw opportunity. His rule began in blood. Rivals were not outmaneuvered, they were erased. He united the Franks under his command, one tribe after another falling to his cunning or his sword. Yet Clovis's greatest victory was not won on the battlefield, but in faith. His wife, Clotilde, was a Christian, and though he resisted her religion, war would drive him to a revelation. At the Battle of Tolbiac, fighting against the Alemanni, his army began to crumble. In desperation, Clovis called upon the God of Clotilde, promising to believe if victory was granted. The Alemanni broke, their king slain, and the Franks triumphed. True to his word, Clovis converted to Christianity, an act that would change the course of Western history. When he was baptized in Reims by Saint Remigius, the chroniclers say that a new Constantine was born. This was no small gesture. While other barbarian kings clung to a heretical branch of Christianity, Clovis embraced the faith of Rome itself. In doing so, he bound the Church and the Franks in a pact that would outlive him. The bishops of Gaul hailed him as protector. The Roman population, long oppressed, saw in him not a conqueror but a savior. From that moment, the sword of the pagan became the shield of the Christian West. Clovis expanded his kingdom ruthlessly, crushing the Visigoths at Vui, subduing the Burgundians, and making Paris his capital. By the time of his death in 511, nearly all of Gaul was his. Yet his reign was more than conquest, it was transformation. The wild chaos of the post-Roman world began to coalesce into something new, the kingdom of the Franks, the seed from which medieval France would grow. The spirit of Gaul had survived once more, wearing a new crown and speaking a new tongue. but still whispering the same ancient song of survival and power. When Clovis died, the world he left behind was still trembling from the weight of his ambition. His kingdom stretched from the forests of the Rhine to the Atlantic coast, from the cold North Sea to the sunlit valleys of Aquitaine. But though his sword had forged unity, his death split it apart. Following the old Frankish custom, his lands were divided among his sons, Euderic, Clodomer, Childebert, and Clotaire. Each inherited not only territory, but a hunger for dominance. The kingdom of the Franks fractured into warring realms, each brother scheming against the other. Their mother, Clotilde, watching in sorrow as her husband's dream of unity turned to blood. Yet beneath the chaos, something remarkable endured. The Roman legacy, the Gallic spirit, and the Frankish ferocity had fused into a single identity. Latin evolved into the early forms of Old French. Roman law blended with Germanic custom, and the Church, stronger than ever, became the binding thread of this new civilization. Bishops replaced Roman governors, monasteries replaced temples, and the cross stood where once the eagle had flown. Gaul, now Francia, was no longer a province but a realm with its own destiny. Still, it was a brutal age. Assassinations, betrayals, and holy wars defined the early Merovingian dynasty. Kings wore their hair long as a symbol of divine right, but beneath their crowns, their thrones were soaked in fear. The court of Neustria plotted against Austrasia. Queens like Fredegund and Brunhild wielded poison and intrigue with the precision of generals. Yet amid the violence, France began to take shape not in palaces, but in monasteries and fields. Monks copied Roman texts, preserving the knowledge that might have vanished forever. Farmers rebuilt the land scarred by centuries of war. The Franks, once tribal warriors, became lords and landowners. And though their kings often descended into madness or greed, their realm endured because it had roots deeper than ambition. In the hearts of its people, the memory of Gaul lived on not as a lost world, but as the soil beneath the new one. The age of empire had ended, and the age of kingdoms had begun. And in this fragile beginning, the echoes of the old Gauls could still be heard, faint but eternal, in the language, the legends, and the blood of a people who refused to vanish. The Merovingians ruled like ghosts of two worlds, half barbarian kings, half Roman lords. Their reign stretched through the 6th and 7th centuries, a time when the boundaries between myth and history blurred. They claimed descent from a sea creature, the legendary Merovic, born of both man and beast, and for generations this myth gave their dynasty an aura of divine mystery. Yet beneath the glitter of legend, their rule was marked by blood and betrayal. These were kings who ruled not by decree but by charisma and violence. They travelled across their realms surrounded by warriors and priests, dispensing justice from horseback, their long hair flowing as the symbol of sacred kingship. Cutting a Merovingian king's hair was to strip him of divine authority, a punishment worse than exile. Still, divine right could not guard against human weakness. Greed and paranoia devoured the dynasty from within. Brothers murdered brothers. Queens plotted assassinations in candlelit chambers. Fredegund, ruthless and cunning, poisoned rivals without hesitation. Brunhild, her rival, ruled through intellect and revenge, outliving kings and commanding armies in an age when few women dared to hold power. Their feud consumed decades, leaving a trail of corpses and civil wars that fractured the realm. Yet, for all the chaos, the Merovingian age was not one of darkness. Beneath the violence, civilization endured. Cities like Paris and Metz became centers of faith and governance. The church, now the most stable institution in the land, filled the vacuum of leadership the kings could not. Bishops became advisors, monasteries became schools, and Christianity spread from valley to coast, baptizing not only people but culture itself. The Druids were long gone, but in quiet ways. Their memory lingered, the reverence for nature, the rhythm of festivals, the sense that the sacred was found in the land as much as in the heavens. The Merovingians ruled by sword and sanctity, but they were no longer conquerors. They were stewards of something ancient reshaped a people who had survived Rome, rebellion, and ruin. And though their line would weaken, though their crown would tarnish, the world they built would endure long after their hair had been shorn and their thrones forgotten. For beyond their fall waited another name, another dynasty that would transform Francia from a fragile kingdom into the heart of a new empire. In the quiet forests and rolling hills of late 5th century Gaul, a figure emerged whose ambition would reshape the continent forever. Clovis, a young Frankish warrior king, was more than a conqueror. He was a strategist, a politician, and a master of perception. Sitting back, relax as we follow his rise. A story of cunning and calculated violence, of alliances forged in fire and diplomacy. Clovis inherited a fragmented realm of Frankish tribes, each with its own customs, rivalries, and warrior bands. Some researchers believe he united these tribes not through brute force alone, but by exploiting their shared desire for dominance and security in a world still haunted by the collapse of Roman order. Others suggest that Clovis's genius lay in his ability to absorb Roman administrative practices, blending them with Germanic traditions to create a new, more resilient political structure. Around 486 CE, he faced Agrius, the last Roman commander in northern Gaul. The Battle of Soissons was more than a clash of armies. It was a confrontation between two worlds. Approximately 15,000 Frankish warriors advanced in disciplined formations, their Franciscoca axes and long spears cutting through the remnants of Roman infantry. Historians describe the noise as a terrifying symphony of war-the clash of iron. The screams of men and horses, the echo of fear and fury across the plains. Victory was total. The remaining Roman soldiers were incorporated into Frankish eunuchs, and any possibility of Roman resurgence was systematically erased. But Clovis's consolidation was not purely martial. He understood the power of religion to unify and legitimize. Around 496 CE, he converted to Catholic Christianity in a calculated move that drew Gallo-Roman support while distinguishing his kingdom from the Arian Christian Visigoths. The baptism, performed by Bishop Remigius, was more than a ceremony. It was a public statement, a symbolic merging of two populations under a single spiritual identity. From that moment, Clovis was both a king of warriors and a protector of the faith, a ruler whose authority rested as much on divine sanction as on military might. He moved strategically, forging alliances, punishing enemies, and absorbing territories into a growing Frankish realm. Each victory brought new lands, new peoples, and new challenges, yet the momentum of his expansion seemed unstoppable. By the end of his reign, the disparate tribes of the Franks were bound under one rule, and northern Gaul was no longer a collection of Romanized provinces or warring clans, but a kingdom poised to influence European history for centuries to come. And yet, even with Clovis's unification, questions linger: how much of Roman culture truly survived, and how much would be rewritten by the new Germanic rulers? As the dust of Clovis's conquests settled over northern Gaul, The land itself seemed to shift beneath the feet of its inhabitants. The urban centers that had once thrived under Roman governance now echoed with a strange emptiness. Their forums deserted, their baths silent, and their streets overgrown, a haunting reminder of a vanished administrative order. Sit back, relax, and imagine walking through these cities. The cracked mosaics underfoot, the faded frescoes on walls, the distant hum of the river carrying whispers of a civilization slowly fading. The Roman elite, once masters of law, trade, and governance, were systematically displaced. Many of their estates were seized by Frankish warriors, men whose expertise lay in the battlefield rather than the marketplace, whose wealth was measured not in coin or property, but in loyalty and martial skill. Some historians suggest that this shift created an abrupt economic contraction, with Mediterranean trade networks faltering as security along routes weakened. Workshops that once produced finely crafted pottery, textiles, and metalwork for distant markets either closed entirely or refocused on local production, creating a patchwork economy far removed from the integrated networks of the Roman Empire. Yet within this upheaval, traces of continuity remained. The Frankish rulers, while militarily dominant, often relied on Gallo-Roman administrators and clergy to manage day-to-day governance. Bishops and educated elites maintained records, collected taxes, and mediated disputes, forming a parallel power structure where ecclesiastical authority sometimes outweighed royal command. The church itself became the primary vessel for cultural preservation. Its monasteries, repositories of classical texts, scribal labor sustaining fragments of knowledge that might otherwise have vanished. Some researchers argue that this hybrid society was neither fully Roman nor fully Germanic, but something new. A synthesis in which Roman law, Christian ritual, and Germanic custom intertwined in subtle, sometimes contradictory ways. Linguistically, Latin persisted, but it absorbed Germanic vocabulary and pronunciations, gradually evolving into the early forms of Old French. Rural communities witnessed similar transformations. The Roman villa system, organized around large estates with slave labor, was replaced by smaller Germanic farmsteads operated by free peasants, shifting both agricultural production and social hierarchy. Burial practices changed as well. Gallo-Roman customs merged with Germanic traditions, creating cemeteries that speak of a blended cultural identity, where jewelry, pottery, and grave goods tell a story of adaptation and survival. Amid this transformation, Christianity played a dual role, both preserving elements of the past while systematically erasing pagan traditions, replacing sacred groves with churches, converting temples, and marginalizing druids. And yet, despite the apparent dominance of Frankish authority, questions linger in the soil and ruins how much of the old Gallo-Roman world truly survived in spirit, and what secrets of its culture were irrevocably lost to the tides of conquest and conversion. As the centuries turned, the landscape of Gaul continued to breathe with transformation, a silent witness to the merging of worlds. Picture the rolling fields dotted with Frankish farmsteads, smoke curling from hearths, Roman roads winding past small villages where Latin words were spoken with Germanic inflections. Sit back and let the soundscape of early medieval Gaul settle around you, the clatter of wooden wheels on cobblestones, the rhythmic hammering in workshops forging tools and weapons, the distant tolling of church bells calling the faithful to prayer. Scholars suggest that this period was less a collapse than a slow, uneasy blending where Roman infrastructure, Germanic social norms, and residual Celtic traditions intersected in unexpected ways. Markets that had once thrived on imperial stability now operated on local trust, bartering, and seasonal fairs. Yet Roman measures and coinage lingered alongside Germanic customs of gift-giving and oath-based exchange. Artistic expression followed a similar path. Mosaics gave way to metalwork inlaid with intricate geometric patterns. Jewelry combined Roman motifs with Germanic symbols, and manuscript illumination began to weave Christian iconography with abstract, interlaced designs reminiscent of Celtic art. Language, too, was in flux. Latin remained the language of the church and administration. Yet everyday speech absorbed Frankish terms, pronunciations shifted, and regional dialects emerged that would eventually seed the development of Old French. Some researchers propose that literacy became increasingly concentrated within monastic centers, where monks meticulously copied both religious texts and remnants of classical literature, shaping the intellectual life of a population otherwise occupied with subsistence and survival. The social order mirrored this duality. Feudal relationships began to crystallize, rooted in Germanic notions of loyalty and service, but overlaid with Roman legal concepts that had persisted in the collective memory of Gallo-Roman families. Land ownership became both a reflection of martial prowess and an inheritance of civil structure, with peasants working fields organized according to patterns that combined Roman estates and Germanic settlements. Religious life was similarly complex. Christianity imposed doctrinal orthodoxy, but local saints, holy wells, and lingering folk beliefs created a tapestry of spiritual practice that was neither entirely Roman nor fully Jewish. Festivals, rituals, and funerary customs blended traditions, reflecting an ongoing negotiation of identity. And yet, beneath these layers of adaptation and survival, questions remain. How deeply did the Gallo-Roman heritage imprint itself on the emerging medieval consciousness? Which elements were deliberately preserved, and which faded like shadows at dusk? As we move to our final section, we will trace how these centuries of synthesis laid the groundwork for a new European civilization, one that carried the echoes of Gaul's past into the centuries to come. As we reach the close of our journey through the history of the Gauls, let your mind drift across the centuries, tracing the faint yet persistent footprints of a civilization that once commanded the heart of Western Europe. Imagine the rolling hills and dense forests of Gaul gradually transforming under the influence of Frankish kings, the clinking of swords and the low hum of Latin prayers blending with the calls of farmers tending their fields. By the 8th century, the distinct Gallo-Roman identity had largely dissolved, yet it left behind a cultural DNA that would ripple through medieval European life. The Frankish kingdoms that arose from the ashes of Roman Gaul carried Roman administrative practices repurposed for Germanic rule. The meticulous record-keeping, land surveys, and legal traditions established centuries earlier under imperial guidance formed the backbone of Carolingian governance. Latin, once the language of law and learning, survived in ecclesiastical and scholarly contexts, slowly evolving under the influence of Germanic vocabulary and Celtic phonetics, eventually giving rise to the Romance languages of France, Belgium, and beyond. Christianity, the force that had helped unify populations under both Roman and Frankish authority, became a conduit for preserving knowledge, yet it also imposed new cultural hierarchies. Monasteries, cathedrals, and episcopal centers not only served as religious hubs, but as repositories of classical texts, technical knowledge, and artistic expression, fostering a continuity that linked medieval Europeans to the distant Roman past. In parallel, Germanic social structures, feudal obligations, warrior loyalty, and kinship bonds, intertwined with remnants of Roman civic organization and Celtic communal practices, creating the complex lattice of medieval society. Even the arts bore witness to this synthesis. Illuminated manuscripts, metalwork, stone carvings, and mosaics all hinted at layers of inherited technique and aesthetic memory, blending Roman symmetry, Celtic motifs, and Germanic symbolism. Yet, perhaps the most subtle, enduring legacy of the Gauls was the notion of identity shaped through centuries of conquest, adaptation, and cultural fusion. Though their distinct language, pagan religions, and civic institutions were largely absorbed or transformed, the Gauls' imprint persisted in regional customs, settlement patterns, and the very fabric of European consciousness. As we let the echoes of their history settle around us, it becomes clear that the story of the Gauls is not merely one of disappearance, but of transformation, civilization that, like sediment in a riverbed, shaped the course of European civilization long after its apparent end. So, as you drift towards sleep, consider the layers of time, conquest, and culture beneath the landscapes of modern France, and listen closely to the whispers of the Gauls, whose legacy flows quietly but inexorably through the veins of history, awaiting discovery in every stone, manuscript, and tradition that survived the tides of change.